Hi, fifth graders, it's Mrs. Burke here, and we're going to finish up the last video lesson in dividing fractions by whole numbers and whole numbers by fractions. So the first video showed how we can do dividing of fractions using a model, and then we moved on to using a number line. Today is going to be the most efficient way and the fastest way, which is using an algorithm. But I do want to emphasize that it's important that you know how to use the models and how to use the number lines, because those are going to give us the visual of what's happening, and it's going to give us the actual understanding of what dividing fractions is. Now, before we can begin today's lesson, we're going to be introduced to a really important word known as the inverse. And that word inverse means the opposite. So today we're going to be looking at inverse operations. Those are opposite operations that undo each other. So the inverse of addition would be subtraction. And for today, the inverse of division would be multiplication. So we're going to be using the strategies for multiplying fractions today to help us to divide fractions. It sounds strange, but that's what we're going to be doing. And finally, we also have to know how to find the inverse of a fraction, or the opposite of a fraction. So to find the inverse of a fraction, you're simply going to flip the numerator with the denominator. So here, if I have the fraction 1/3, to find the inverse, I'm going to flip my numerator and denominator, and now my fraction is 3/1, or 3 wholes. If I have the fraction 3/4, the inverse would be 4/3. And if I have the fraction 2/5, my inverse would be 5/2. So that quick little strategy is going to be important for us today. So we're going to memorize this little saying that I hope sticks in your head all unit long. And these are 3 magic words. The first word is keep. The second word, sorry, I'm just writing these, would be change. And the final word is flip. So keep, change, flip. These are going to be our steps for dividing fractions. Keep, change, flip. Now watch as I demonstrate this. So these are the same questions. We'll start by doing a whole number divided by a fraction. These are the same questions I used in the dividing fractions using your number line. So we should be getting the same quotient since it's the same equation. So I'm going to start with our first question, which is 5 divided by 1/4. And I'll write that on my whiteboard. 5 divided by 1/4. But I'm going to need some extra room because I'm actually going to be rewriting this using the inverse. So I'm going to start with my number 5. But I'm going to use, instead of division, I'm going to use multiplication to solve this, the inverse. So the inverse of division is multiplication. But if I use the inverse operation, I also have to find the inverse of this fraction, or the opposite. So I'm going to flip the numerator and the denominator. So the opposite of 1/4 would be 4 wholes, or 4/1. Now, we learned last time that I can multiply this by turning this into a fraction by just giving it a denominator of 1. So now I really have 5 wholes times 4 wholes, or 5/1 times 4/1, which gives me 20/1, or just 20. And like I said in the last video, if my first factor is a whole number, my quotient should be also a whole number, so 20. But what I actually did was, this whole thing that I said you're going to remind yourself, keep, change, flip, I'm going to keep my first factor exactly the same. I'm going to change the operation, and I'm going to flip my fraction. Keep, change, flip. so watch me solve the next question, and I'll move a little bit quicker so you can see it in action. So here I have a whole number divided by a fraction, 2 divided by 1/2. So I'm gonna write that down. 2 divided by 1/2. I'm going to keep my first factor. I'm going to change my operation, and I'm going to flip my second factor. 1/2 becomes 2/1. Now I know that I can make this a fraction by just giving it a denominator of 1. And now I'm ready to multiply and solve. 2 times 2 is 4. 1 times 1 is 1. So 4/1, or 4 wholes. Keep, change, and then I flipped it. If you don't flip this, you're not going to get the correct quotient. You have to make sure, say to yourself over and over, keep, change, flip, keep, change, flip. All right, let's look at the next one. I have 3 divided by 1/3. I'm going to rewrite my question. 3 divided by 1/3. And maybe even up here, keep, change, flip. Ready? So I'm going to keep my first factor. I'm going to change the operation to the inverse. I'm going to flip to get this inverse. Now I'm ready to multiply once I make that a fraction. Multiply my numerators, I get 9. Multiply my denominators, I get 1. Or 9 wholes. Keep, change, flip. Easy enough? Not too bad, right? So that's how we can use an algorithm. So I want you to solve one on your own and see what you get. Let's do 6 divided by 1/3. All right, give that a try. Remember, keep, change, flip. Give you about 20 seconds for this. Okay, my first factor I'm going to keep. Operation I change to multiplication, and I flip my second factor. I'm going to turn this into a fraction, and now I'm ready to multiply my numerators, multiply my denominators, and I get 18. I started with a whole, I should be ending with a whole number, not a fraction. All right, so that is how we divide a whole number by a fraction using a standard algorithm. Now let's divide a fraction by a whole number. So let's start with this. It is the same exact steps. So we have 1/5 divided by 2. 1/5 divided by 2. Now before I start, I know I'm going to be keeping this, changing this, flipping this. But it seems like, what is there to flip? So before I even begin, I'm going to quickly just make this a fraction by putting it with a denominator of 1. So now I can clearly see there'll be something to flip. So do that extra 5-second step. It'll make it much easier as you're flipping your equation. So here I go. Keep the 1/5. Change the operation. Flip my 2/1 or 2 wholes, so that becomes 1/2. Multiply my numerators, multiply my denominators, and my answer is 1/10. And remember, if I'm starting with a fraction and I'm dividing it, I'm making it smaller, my quotient should be even smaller than I started. So this should not be a whole number. This should be an even smaller fraction than what I started with. So that's one way to check myself. All right, let's try another. Now we have 1/4 divided by 3. I'm gonna write my equation. Before I start, I notice I don't have anything to flip yet, so I'm just gonna give it a denominator of 1, which is still equivalent. This still has a value of 3. Now I'm ready. I'm gonna keep it, change the operation, flip it. Keep, change, flip. Multiply my numerators, multiply my denominators, and my answer is 1/12. 1/4 divided by 3 equals 1/12. Alrighty, your turn. We have 1/7 divided by 3. So show me what that would look like. Make sure you change that 3 to a fraction before you get started. Okay, so I'm going to change this quickly to a fraction by giving it a denominator of 1. I'm going to keep my first factor the same, change my operation, and flip my second fraction to get the inverse. And my new equation is 1/7 times 1/3, and that's going to give me a quotient of 1/21, or 1/21. Okay, so that is the fast way to divide your fractions. Don't make careless mistakes. Make sure you're taking care of this whole number here and turning it into a fraction before you start. Make sure you're keeping your first factor. Make sure you're changing your operation. And finally, make sure you're flipping your second factor. Okay? Have fun with these. If you really want to go the extra mile, pick 2 of the strategies. Get an equation, maybe solve it standard first, and then see if you can draw a model for it. Or solve it standard and then see if you can use a number line to get the same answer. Try your best. We're already so proud. See you soon, Stuart.